He never screamed, never insulted her, never had to. He had a cleaner weapon, the language of healing. You're projecting. I'm setting a boundary. You need to regulate before we continue. Every word sounded reasonable. Reasonable enough to trust. Reasonable enough to repeat. Reasonable enough to carry home inside your own head. And after enough conversations like that, Rachel stopped trusting what she felt. If you've ever left a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered it, not because someone shouted you down, but because they made your feelings sound technically flawed, this is what was happening. And by the end of this, you'll understand how someone can rewrite another person from the inside, using nothing but the right vocabulary. Rachel once told her therapist she thought she was in a healthy relationship. At the time, even that sounded believable. Elliot had made sure of that. Rachel was 29, a graphic designer at a small agency. The kind of person who noticed tension in a room before anyone named it. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't dramatic. She was emotionally fluent. The type who could sense when a friend was off and adjust without being asked. And that detail mattered. Because when someone emotionally fluent starts doubting her own feelings, her first instinct isn't suspicion. It's self-examination. Elliot appeared the way careful people do. Quiet confidence at a friend's dinner. He'd been in therapy for 3 years. He talked about doing the work, about showing up, about holding space for difficult emotions. None of those words are dangerous on their own. But Elliot didn't use them to connect. He used them to diagnose. He didn't argue. He diagnosed. And Rachel, who valued self-awareness more than almost anything, didn't see that as a warning. She saw it as proof. It didn't feel like control. Not at 3 months, not at 6, not even at a year, when she'd started filtering her own emotions before she spoke. That felt like growth. It already wasn't. The first sign didn't look like manipulation. It looked like maturity. They had a disagreement about something small, schedules. Rachel said she was frustrated. Not yelling, not blaming, just frustrated. Elliot paused, tilted his head. Then, carefully, "Can you sit with that for a moment before we continue? I want to make sure you're responding and not reacting." Responding, not reacting. It sounded reasonable. And Rachel, because she valued emotional intelligence, sat with it. The conflict never stayed where she placed it. The moment she named a problem, the spotlight shifted to the way she was naming it. The topic disappeared. Her feelings became the subject. He didn't argue. He diagnosed. That's why she couldn't fight back. Have you ever raised a concern in a relationship and somehow ended up examining your tone instead of the problem you came to discuss? That's not communication. That's redirection. And it works because it borrows the vocabulary of healing to perform the mechanics of control. Over the next few months, Elliot's language became more precise. When Rachel said something that made him uncomfortable, he didn't get defensive. He said, "I'm noticing some projection here." When she asked why he'd been distant, he said, "I'm setting a boundary around my emotional bandwidth right now." When she cried during an argument, he waited, then said, "I need you to regulate before we can continue this conversation." Regulate, bandwidth, projection. Every word borrowed from therapy. Every word turned into a wall. She couldn't object, because objecting to boundaries made her the problem. Objecting to regulation made her the unstable one. Challenging self-care made her toxic. He had found a language that couldn't be questioned, because questioning it meant you hadn't done enough work on yourself. And this is where the control becomes almost invisible. The scariest part wasn't that she was losing arguments. It was that she was starting to enter them already half convinced he might be right. She'd prepare what she was going to say hours in advance. Not because the conversation was difficult, because she knew her feelings would need to pass inspection before they were heard. That's not emotional maturity. That's a checkpoint. And someone installed it. One night, she tried to tell him something had hurt her. She'd spent 40 minutes choosing the words. She led with I statements. She didn't blame. She didn't raise her voice. He listened, then said, "I appreciate you sharing that, but I want to flag. The way you framed it felt a little like you were assigning intent, and that's something we could both work on." She apologized for having a feeling, out loud. And it didn't feel strange until she was brushing her teeth 2 hours later and caught her own face in the mirror. She stared at it, and for a second, just a second, she couldn't tell whether the expression looking back at her was sadness or something she'd been taught to call dysregulation. That was the night she stopped recognizing her own face without translating it first. That should have scared her. Instead, it sounded responsible. By month 10, Rachel had developed a habit she didn't recognize as damage. Before saying anything emotional, she'd run it through a filter. Is this reactive? Is this projection? Am I dysregulated? Is this actually about him or about me? She thought she was growing. She told her friends she was doing the work. She was, just not the kind she thought. She was learning to pre-edit her inner world to match a standard Elliot had set, a standard that moved every time she met it. When she was calm, she was intellectualizing. When she was emotional, she was flooding. When she tried to name the pattern, he said, gently, like a teacher, "I think what you're describing is your attachment style activating." Her attachment style, not his behavior. Never his behavior. He didn't argue. He diagnosed. That's why she started believing him. There's a name for this: epistemic coercion. Put simply, someone slowly takes away your confidence in your own reading of reality. Not by denying every event, by overruling your interpretation of it, until their version sounds more valid than yours. Elliot didn't deny what happened. He told her she was interpreting it wrong. And then he offered the correct interpretation, wrapped in language she'd been taught to respect. The moment you start editing pain before naming it, the control is already inside. If you're in it right now, you probably don't call it control. You probably call it working on yourself. By month 12, Rachel's internal filter ran on its own. She'd started journaling, not to process, but to assemble evidence. Evidence that her feelings were justified. She was 29 years old, writing permission slips to feel sad. And then his vocabulary found new rooms. And this is how control protects itself. Not by locking the door, by discrediting anyone who knocks on it. she started losing people. Not because Elliot told her to cut them off. He never said that. He said, "I just think some of your friendships might be activating patterns that aren't serving you." Serving you. That phrase sounded like care. It functioned like isolation. Her best friend Nadia called one evening. Rachel told her, cautiously, that she'd been feeling distant from Elliot. Nadia said, "That doesn't sound like boundaries. That sounds like someone making you earn presence." Rachel repeated the conversation to Elliot that night. He listened carefully, then said, "Nadia has a pattern of enmeshment in her own relationships. It makes sense that she'd project that onto ours." Rachel stopped calling Nadia. Not because she disagreed with her, because the cost of agreeing felt too high. After that, every outside voice arrived pre-contaminated. If someone agreed with Rachel, they were enmeshed. If they questioned Elliot, they were projecting. If they saw the pattern, they became part of it. He didn't argue. He diagnosed. That's why no one saw it. The breaking point was small. Of course it was. A Wednesday evening. Rachel came home from work. She was tired. She said, "I had a rough day." Elliot looked up from his laptop and said, gently, with the kind of precision that used to make her feel safe, "Can you be more specific? Rough is a bit vague for me to hold space for." Hold space for. She stood in the doorway. And for the first time in 14 months, she didn't try to translate. She just thought, "I can't even say I'm tired," without it becoming homework. She closed the door quietly, sat on the bathroom floor for 8 minutes, and didn't cry. She stared at her phone, at a voice memo she'd recorded 3 days earlier, talking herself through whether she was allowed to feel hurt about something he'd said. Allowed. Her own voice, asking for permission to feel. And once his language showed up in a room he wasn't in, the damage was no longer private. The next morning, a colleague asked if she was okay. Rachel said yes, then added, reflexively, without thinking, "Sorry, I'm probably just projecting." The colleague stared at her. Projecting what? Rachel couldn't answer. She'd used his word, in a room where he wasn't even present. He wasn't in the room, but his framework was. Her therapist, her own, separate from Elliot, asked one question that week. When was the last time you expressed an emotion in that relationship and it was simply received? Rachel opened her mouth. Nothing came. Not because she couldn't remember, because the answer arrived too fast, and it was empty. She almost went back. 3 days after she told Elliot she needed distance, she saw his Instagram story. A quote about vulnerability, about how real intimacy means sitting with discomfort. She held her phone for 11 minutes. She scrolled through his older posts. Every one of them sounded like someone she'd want to be with. Emotionally intelligent, open, safe. And that was the cruelest part, because the words hadn't changed, only what she now knew they were for. Because the version of him that talked about growth felt real, and walking away meant accepting that the language of healing had been used as a weapon. That every time he'd said, "I'm just trying to understand you," he'd been building a cage out of words she wasn't allowed to question. She put the phone down, That was the first feeling she didn't translate. Elliot didn't chase her. He posted a story the following week, something about honoring the process and letting people go with grace. Grace. As if the 14 months had been a mutual journey. Some people who use therapy language this way do it strategically. Some do it without realizing. For the person on the receiving end, the effect is equally destructive. What stays isn't the memory of the person, it's the method. The pause before you trust your own anger. The reflex to cross-examine your own hurt. The feeling that every emotion has to earn the right to exist. From the outside, that looks like growth. From the inside, it feels like erasure. That voice. Is this reactive? Am I projecting? Am I sure this is real? It doesn't sound like Elliot anymore. It sounds like you. Rachel changed her phone number 6 months later. Not to hide. Just to stop waiting for a notification that would make her question leaving. Nadia is still waiting for a call that hasn't come. If someone came to your mind while watching this, there's a reason for that. He didn't argue. He diagnosed. That's why she still checks. And sometimes, when that dynamic enters the wrong kind of therapy room, it doesn't get exposed. It gets reinforced. That one's next.